come in. So good afternoon, everyone. It is great to reconnect with you again today and to specifically hone in on one of the council's advocacy priorities, transportation. So we are delighted to have so many of you come back today. Thank you for that. Thanks for the feedback on yesterday's session. I'm hopeful that today's is equally informative and also gives opportunity for live questions. Thanks for those of you who offered questions in the chat yesterday. Today we're in a meeting format, so you'll be able to ask your questions using your own voice instead of your fingertips. So at various points throughout the hour, I will pause and invite questions, and that's an opportunity for you to unmute your mic and to ask your question. If you want to hold your question in the chat and put it there, you're welcome to, but you'll have opportunities to ask verbally as well. A very quick and easy tip for unmuting and muting is to hit your space bar, and that will temporarily unmute your mic. So you don't even have to worry about other keystrokes. So if you don't know that quick tip yet, let me share that with you. And then as soon as you let up on that space bar, your mic mutes again. We're going to ask folks to keep your mics muted during the session so that we reduce the audio commotion for the session and folks can really hunker in and be able to listen to what's going on. So, so again, warm welcome. All righty. So what we'd like to do today is to start out by reviewing in greater detail the council's work and advocacy priorities and positions on transportation. We have till about 12:30 to do some of that work and to begin thinking then about our elevator speeches when we meet with legislators. And so I'll kick off the work on priorities and positions. And then Aaron and Michael will do some of the focus work on preparing our elevator speeches, how we connect our own personal stories to the legislative priorities. At 12:30, no matter where we are in the process, we'll hit pause because that's when Secretary Designee Craig Thompson will join us for about a 15-minute visit to talk about DOT's work in transportation equity issues and an opportunity to ask him questions then. And then we'll resume that work on preparing elevator speakers and offer opportunities for questions and for maybe sharing some of your elevator speech ideas. So, and then we'll wrap up with some reminders about getting visits scheduled, and then we'll end by 1 o'clock. So that's the roadmap for where we are headed. So transportation is a really fundamental priority of the councils, and because it is so critical to so many aspects of our lives, and I don't need to tell any of us what those aspects are because we know them and live them, we devote a lot of energy and resources to our advocacy work in transportation. So what I want to do is talk with you about the budgetary focus that we have, the legislative focus, and then our state agency focus. As I'm describing these things to you, I want to invite you to think about your own personal story and which of our advocacy positions and talking points do you personally really connect with so that you can highlight those in your legislative visit. So let's start with our relationship with state agencies. And I suspect that Secretary Thompson will focus here as well. So we know a lot of work can get done outside the legislature. And sometimes that very stuff that makes a difference in the daily lives of folks can get done without legislative action. and also sometimes setting long-term strategic initiatives for things can get done initially outside the legislature and then brought to the legislature for the next step of action. So a couple of years ago, one of the council's main priorities was asking the Wisconsin Department of Transportation to put together a non-driver interagency council. And we asked for that. Other disability and aging groups asked for it as well. And Wisconsin DOT listened and formed the Wisconsin Non-Driver Advisory Council, of which I am very proud to serve as a co-chair. This council is made up of many state agencies because Wisconsin Department of Transportation is not the only place where transportation programs that serve our communities reside. There's programs across state agencies. So state agencies are partners. Transportation operators are partners. Municipalities, towns, the municipalities are partners. State legislators are partners and advocates are partners. And we meet to really look at both what short-term fixes we can put into place that don't have to go to the legislature. And then we also look at strategic long-term changes in transportation because, as you know, transportation is a complex problem in this state that will take a lot of really good minds to figure out. I suspect that Secretary will talk about the non-driver advisory committee when he comes because it's really a feather in his cap as an agency leader that this advisory committee has formed, is very functional and is doing really good work. So I'll hold off on saying more about that work now, but it's really helping to set a different course for transportation for the non-driver in the state of Wisconsin. We also partner with other coalitions of advocating agencies in the Coalition for More Responsible Transportation. And that's a great coalition. If any of you are interested in connecting with it, meets about quarterly, and it's advocates from all sorts of sectors: environmental, disability, aging, poverty, so that people are putting their heads together about what can we do to increase transportation options and viability for folks in the state who do not drive or do not choose to drive. On the budget level, some of the things that the council will be asking for in this current state budget, and here are some of the things that we'd like to have you help us with, is that we know we need to see more money put into the specialized transportation program. Aaron touched on this yesterday, noting that the governor has recommended an inflationary increase for specialized transportation. We're asking for a 10% increase, as are several other disability and aging groups. The Specialized Transportation Fund, also known as 8521, is so important because it gives money to counties to do transportation work specifically focused on the needs of people with disabilities and older adults. And in some of our counties, particularly the more rural ones, this is the transportation system. There may be volunteer driver programs and things that are kind of cobbled together, but this is transportation for folks who need it. So this program is so vital to breaking down the transportation barriers that folks in rural Wisconsin face on a daily basis. We, of course, are asking for a budget increase for mass transit in our more urban and suburban areas, because we know that is also what connects people. Right now, there is no formal ask in the governor's budget for mass transit. And so we're asking for, at minimum, an inflationary increase and the increases to be able to do particular special projects and capital projects. So, mass transit, if that's important to you, that's definitely a highlight area. If you live rural, or have family and friends that are rural, really focusing on the specialized transit would be really an outstanding thing to ask for. We are also asking and supporting in the governor's budget the increased DMV, Department of Motor Vehicle Services. Now, that might sound strange to a bunch of people that don't drive. Like, why do we need more DMV service center hours and service center locations? But if you remember, your ID, your Wisconsin state ID, or your real ID, federal ID, is what gets you your ballot. It's also a legal document that we need for so many aspects of life. And with the decrease that we've seen over the last number of years in the availability of Department of Motor Vehicle offices, we know that given transportation barriers and how far folks might need to travel, particularly in rural areas, to get to a DMV, that we need to see those service centers both increase their hours and increase their availability. The governor's office and DOT have studied where some of the gaps are with, and one of them is in Dane County. There is Yeah, it's very difficult to get to a DMV in Dane County. It also is very difficult to get to one in Brown County. So in the budget are expansions for those DMV centers. If there's a DMV that's not located close to you in your area, this is something excellent to bring up and why that matters to you as a non-driver, to be able to have access to that important documentation for so many things. One of the things that is not in the governor's budget, but we are asking for and doing seed planting on, is a grants program to come out of the Wisconsin Department of Transportation for accessible pedestrian signals. There's money that comes from the federal government for accessible pedestrian signals, and we know that it's insufficient. There's more signals asked for than municipalities are able to pay for. And if you have ever used an accessible pedestrian signal or advocated for one, and I know there are folks on this call who have done an enormous amount of work to advocate for talking crossing signals or accessible pedestrian signals. You know that it's a big advocacy lift, and part of the reason it's such a lift is because they're expensive and municipalities hesitate to spend the money on them. So we would like to see a small grants program that municipalities could apply for those signals when their federal funding is insufficient to supply them. And by the way, if you're wanting one of those in your community, you have to advocate for them by going to your municipal officials and starting the appropriate chain to ask for an accessible pedestrian signal. And there will be a whole sequence of activities that need to happen. So if you're ever interested in learning more about that, I can talk with you privately about it, both having advocated for them and also serving as a transportation commissioner for the city of Madison. But we'd like to see additional funding for them. And then the last budgetary item that we are asking for, again, not in the governor's budget, so this would be a new idea, is we'd like to see state agencies really look at efficiencies for making sure that they evaluate what things are they asking people to come to their office to do that really could be done over the phone or over the web. So think about maybe the last time you needed a birth certificate or a deed if you own property. You had to go someplace to get that. You had to go to Department of Health Services to get your birth certificate, the Register of Deeds to get your deed. You had to arrange transportation to get there. You had to arrange transportation to come back. It took a chunk of time and you had to coordinate your schedule around it. Basically, it is burdensome burdensome to have to go someplace to get those documents. And so we have been, it's one of been the things that we've been talking about on the non-driver advisory committee, is really looking at where can we skip the trip? Where can state agencies build infrastructure so that we don't have to make a physical trip to get the important documentation that we might need? And so we'd like to see some budget money allocated for that so state agencies can do that study and that revamp of their resources, retooling to be able to do the skip the trip initiatives. I'm going to do the legislative asks, which are pretty brief, and then I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions. So a couple of things that we're asking for from the legislature is the governor has put a provision in which would allow for levy caps to be removed. And what that would do, Aaron mentioned this yesterday, so I want to circle back on it. It would allow municipalities to be able to have more flexible spending to be able to run transportation across municipal lines. And right now in the state of Wisconsin, state law prohibits that from happening. And so we become landlocked, essentially, as we all well know, in our municipal area when we can't cross into another community, when we can't cross into another county. Maybe our job is in another county, but we have really limited or no transportation services to get there. And we end up needing to either quit the job or get very creative and very stressed out about how we manage to get from A to B. So the governor is asking for some ways to better allow municipalities to do regional or cross-municipal transportation. So that would be an excellent ask when you're talking with your legislator. The other thing that concerns us on a legislative note is that while we do have the white cane law, and it does require stopping within 10 feet of a pedestrian with a white cane or using a service animal, the penalty for violating that is really pretty small. And there's not a lot of effort that goes into both educating about it and doing surveillance about it. And so we'd like to see some dedication to potentially increasing the penalty, some dedication for increasing surveillance of it and education of it. You're really doing some work with police officers, doing work with state patrol, which is where a lot of police officers are changed, to increase people's knowledge about that and to even have it highlighted in drivers education programs. So I'm going to pause there because that's a lot to take in, and just see if there's a couple questions that folks have about the council's transportation priorities and positions. And then after a few questions, I'll turn it to Aaron and Michael to start talking about preparing for the elevator speech. And we're about 10 minutes out from the secretary's arrival. So anybody have questions that you'd like to ask about the transportation work that we are undertaking? And go ahead and unmute when you're ready. Okay, I'll circle back and see. Just I want to make sure give folks time to get that unmute hit. And as you know, you're thinking about what I just shared, what really resonates for you, what really connects for you that you can carry into your visits. So Aaron and Michael, let me turn it to you to start kicking us off on the preparation for the visit and developing that elevator speech.
Thank you, Denise, for that great recap of the council's legislative agenda related to transportation. So just to recap again, we talked about this yesterday, but the opportunities to advocate right now. The council is asking everyone who participates in these trainings to set up a visit with their state representative and state senator. And then we're also, our timing is really great. We're at the start of the state budget process. And so right now the budget is before the Joint Finance Committee. Starting this week, they'll be holding their first of 4 public hearings on the budget, which will recap those dates really quickly. But again, Denise already summarized this, but to highlight kind of the main things in the budget related to the council's asks are mass transit funding. The governor did put in a 2.5% per year increase to mass transit. And then specialized transit, which is funding for older adults and people with disabilities. The council's asking for a 10% increase. The governor put in a 2.5% increase for that program as well. And then as Denise said, grants for pedestrian signals. There's nothing in the budget currently. And then there is funding for 2 new customer service centers for the DMV in Madison and Green Bay. So those are kind of the main budget asks. There's not really specific legislation that we're following quite yet this session. So we're really focused on the state budget. So again, main opportunities to advocate on the state budget right now are those Joint Finance Committee public hearings. The first one is this week, April 9th at UW Whitewater at 10 a.m. It's in person. Then there is one on April 21st at the Hodag Dome in Rhinelander, also in person and starting at 10 a.m. And then April 22nd at UW Stout in person, starting at 10 a.m. Then there is one virtual opportunity, which I think is what most people on this call would be interested in. And that hearing is going to be April 28th. Also sounds like starting at 10 a.m., but there's not a lot of details about the virtual option yet. We do know that pre-registration will be required. We expect it to fill up very quickly. So the council will get information out when registration does open, but just a heads up on that. And so again, recapping whether you're meeting with your state representative or your state senator, you really want to think about framing the meeting in terms of an elevator pitch. So again, that's covering who are you? So your name or any affiliations you may have. If you serve on a board or if you work for a company that might be of interest and it's okay for you to talk about that in the context of the meeting, feel free to mention that. And then what is your issue? So for the purposes of today's training, the issue is lack of transit access in Wisconsin or lack of transportation options. And then why does this matter? So great things for you to talk about from your real world perspective. If you were on the call last night with Representative Subak, I loved the phrase she used, you are the expert on you. So those are the kind of things you want to look to talk about in meetings with your state representative or senator. These same principles also apply if you're testifying at a joint finance public hearing. So this can be examples about, if you, because of lack of transit, you can't get to work, or you feel isolated, or you can't make it to medical appointments. So any examples from your lived experience that connect to the consequences of not having transit access or transit options are the things you want to think about brainstorming to bring up in this meeting. And then again, what's your ask? So on this particular issue of transportation, we talked through the council's kind of 4 main asks in this area. So that's, increasing transit funding, increasing specialized transit funding, providing funding for pedestrian walkway signals. And then as Denise mentioned, encouraging changes to state law to allow transit systems to connect to one another to cross municipal or county lines. So those are the kind of asks that we want to put in front of lawmakers to include in the state budget. And then again, just to expand a little bit on ways that you can brainstorm to translate your personal story into a legislative ask. So you, again, want to think about, what is your goal that you want the legislature to do something about? And what are the key elements of your personal story that relate to that goal? So that can be something, that you personally have experience with. It doesn't have to be citing a study or an article. It can just be you talking about your own lived experiences. Or it could be something that you do have professional knowledge of or academic knowledge of. And then finding ways just to kind of link your story to your goal. So generally, those are the ways to prepare yourself to talk about these issues. I don't know if people have questions, or if Michael or Denise, if you want to add anything. If you have examples of things that you bring up in legislative meetings when you talk about transit access, Denise.
Excuse
Sorry.
me, Denise.
Yeah, go ahead with the question first, and then I can do an example.
Thank you, Denise. This is John Hapley. I'm up in Rib Mountain.
Yeah, John.
My wife has advocated for pedestrian crossing signals very hard.
Yep.
I'd like to say, as long as we have the DOT online, could we get them to include them in all new construction?
Yeah, John, that's a great ask. And so I think the DOT doesn't do that direct oversight on municipal streets. So I think it's important to understand that, because otherwise municipalities frankly get really irritated with the state, because the state is doing oversight on their property. So when we do DOT, Wisconsin Department of Transportation construction, that I think it is really a great ask to have APS installed. And then in the municipal area, really advocating with your local government about their importance. I can tell you from a practical standpoint, kind of knowing what the law is and knowing what the funding looks like, they will still divert to having to have someone express the need first. And the federal law is written that way. So it would actually need to be a federal change to install them everywhere. So it will, at least for the time being, take all of us to really raise up the issue of how these are important, not only to those of us who are blind and visually impaired, but what they do for greater community access. So we're still on the education part of this curve, because right now, leaders see how much these things cost, and they're usually a couple thousand to 10,000, depending on what they are, and they see cost over somebody asking. So we are still needing to really educate to help people understand why these are important before I think they're going to be willing to continue, regularly build them into budget.
Excuse me, Denise, can I have a follow-up with you?
Of course you can. And here comes Secretary Thompson too. So John, go ahead quick, and then we'll get Craig on board.
The true fact of the matter, it would just be a couple $1,000s, because you're already putting walkway buttons in.
Right.
It would just be, because it cost us, the ones we did cost us $6,000 an intersection.
Yep.
That was for 4 buttons per intersection. I think the cost would be very minimal. And when you go to your local government, the famous words that they say is, we meet the minimum or the DOT requirement. Okay, that's
right.
what I hear all the time. And
Yep.
Thank you for taking my question.
You bet, John. Thank you for being such a great advocate on this issue. I really appreciate it. So let's take a pause from where we are currently at to warmly welcome Secretary Craig Thompson from the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. And Secretary, we are just over the moon delighted to have you spend some time with us this afternoon. It's, as you know, it's the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired's Advocacy Days. We should just say Advocacy Week. But today we are specifically focusing on transportation. So we really value the incredible partnership we're building with Wisconsin DOT and your advocacy work on behalf of the non-driver non-driver, and would love to give you an opportunity to talk about some of the work that is happening at WISDOT to promote the work of the non-driver, some of the things related to the budget that you see as really important for creating greater access. And, take about 15 minutes or so, and we'll create time for questions from our audience as well. And it's folks from all over the state that are on the call today.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Denise. And I really appreciate the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with the group today and all of the really great advocacy that your group has been doing. When you say not just the day of the week, Jess, I think it's 365 days a year from what I've seen. And your group does a tremendous job. As Denise mentioned, we chose over the last year and a half to form a non-driver advisory committee here at the department to really try to look holistically at how we are treating and how we are accommodating for the non-drivers, which are such a significant portion of our population here in Wisconsin. And I think it's a recognition that we need to do better. We need to think about it more in our planning stages, whether it is in regard to what we're including when we're working with the locals on local streets, what we're including when we're building roads, and obviously what we're including when we're looking at mass transit assistance, elderly and disabled assistance, and passenger rail assistance, and working for that. And Denise has agreed to be the co-chair of this non-driver advisory committee, which has been just invaluable from my standpoint, the leadership that Denise has provided on this. So I really believe it's already had significant impacts internally on us, on our staff here at the DOT with the external partners we have. And I know it's informing some of the recommendations and decisions that are, come out of the governor's budget. So I really want to start off by saying I'm hoping that the council and this group is finding that helpful as well. I know we are, and sometimes we don't see some of the concrete results we want as quickly as we would like, but I think it is definitely changing an approach, and I think it will result in some very meaningful policy changes. I'm hopeful for moving on, because we also do, we involve policymakers in this group, and a lot of the exercises that we've gone in through taking, people through to try to put people in the shoes of folks that have to plan their trips more deliberately than others of us have to do. And a lot of those things I think has been really, really instructive. So we've been really thrilled so far. Eileen Switzer is our division administrator for our Division of Budget and Strategic Initiatives, and has been our point person. And I know on behalf of her, she's really appreciated the leadership that Jess has provided on that non-driver advisory committee. When we look at the budget that the governor has proposed to the legislature as it pertains to transportation, I think again, he really tried to focus on where his values are. We came off a budget in the previous biennium where there was strong advocacy. The governor had one of the three things he had ran on was fixing our transportation system. And there was a fairly significant revenue increase included in the last budget, really for the first time in a generation, and tried to put the money, all of the increased dollars went really into two areas as it pertained to roads, and it was fixing what we have. It was giving the money to locals to help them with their transportation, and then putting it into our rehabilitation program. But in that budget, the governor also proposed a 10% increase in mass transit operating assistance, a $10 million grant program for bus capital replacement, and some other issues for mass transit that unfortunately those parts were greatly reduced. The bus capital assistance was removed from the budget as it went through, and that mass transit operating assistance was reduced down to 2%. So if we look at heading into this budget, the governor didn't feel like with all of the economic uncertainty that is going on in people's lives pertaining to the pandemic, that it was a time to look at increased revenues in the form of user fees again. So We did slightly increase our bonding levels that we had driven down dramatically in the previous budget and tried to just focus it really in very, very small areas. And where his priorities and what we're putting into this proposed budget is a $75 million new multimodal local supplement grant program that we had tried to create last time through a veto, but that had gone to the Supreme Court and they had overturned that. And so it all went into the local road improvement program. But we're once again trying to make it a multimodal local supplement program where the locals can determine for the pots of money that go to the towns, the pot of money that would go to the cities and villages, and then the pot of money that would go to the counties, where most of their needs are. And I think undoubtedly a lot of those will be in local roads, but I think there are other modes and other areas that are really important to communities, and we should allow the locals to be able to decide that. Then the governor proposed a 2.5% increase in each year in mass transit operating assistance. Once again, proposing a $10 million bus capital replacement program. Is proposed returning legislation to complete streets, as well as removing the statutory barrier that was passed recently from locals being able to use eminent domain to allow for bike and pedestrian paths as well. Also not typically thought not as much of in terms of transportation, but obviously the Division of Motor Vehicles is housed in Wisconsin here within transportation. The governor proposed motor voter registration. And I was going to talk a bit too. I know voting rights are so important to this group too. And it's another area that I think you've all done tremendous advocacy on. So did propose the motor voter registration as well. And I know my Assistant Deputy Secretary Joel Nilsestoon has talked with Jess and is going to be attending a meeting on with one of the voting rights coalitions that you're involved in and are going to be participating in. And then as well as another increase in our 8522 program. So, you know, a lot of these things are going to be hard to maintain, I think, within this legislature, especially the mass transit operating assistance uppers that the governor has proposed again, as well as the bus capital replacement and the complete streets and some of the other things. So, you know, if you're supportive of those measures, anything you can do to help share your voice on that, I think would be tremendously helpful. So with that, Denise, I didn't want to take up all of the time with me talking. I'd be happy to take questions and respond to any concerns that people may have.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that overview. I have a question to kick it off, and then we'll see other folks as well. So with the pots of money that can go for local roads, can some of that be designated for complete streets? Because I know that is a real concern for members of this group. And I know in talking with your staff, they've done a lot of focus on trying to do better complete streets for accessibility. And originally, I know the plan was going to take about 35 years to have existing roads be more complete streets and have better accessibility features built into them. And you've worked really hard to reduce that to 14 years, which still sounds like a really long time. But
Yes.
I'm wondering about you know, the allocation of those funds. Is that something that local municipalities can use it for? So when we go to our local municipalities, we can say to them, by the way, you got this local roads money. We'd like to see it used for complete streets, accessible pedestrian signals, you know, curb ramps, things that would really create greater access.
Yeah, thank you for that, Denise. So, you know, the several, I can't remember the year, but the legislature did really take away the ability for complete streets when using state funds. And so that's one of the things the governor has proposed in this budget is to allow for that again, for complete streets on local roads where it makes sense. Not every single local road would make sense for that, but we do want to go back to the way it previously was, where we can use those dollars with the locals for complete streets, but that would require that language staying in the budget, which again, I think is going to be a lift with the current makeup of the legislature. So it's going to take some advocacy.
Good, thank you. That's important for us to know. I appreciate that. Let me check with folks in our audience to see if there are things you'd like to learn from Secretary Thompson.
So Denise, there is
This
a question.
Lynn.
Oh, go ahead, Lynn.
We do have a question in the chat from Peter. It's a two-parter. First, how is crossing at roundabouts being facilitated? And secondly, what about President Biden's infrastructure plan? What can it do for us in Wisconsin?
So to answer the first question, Peter, about facilitating crossing at roundabouts, I'm going to have to, Jess, can I get back through you to get a better answer? I don't have a real good answer on that.
You know, yes, absolutely. That would be awesome. And I can say, Peter, that I meet with road builders quite frequently. I just had a meeting with an engineering firm that contracts with WisDOT last week, and I've met with WisDOT bureau chiefs and engineers quite a bit, and we've talked about roundabouts. And you know, the summary of my statement is, please just don't. Because there isn't good guidance. They're not signalized. There's no federal guidance for signalizing them, and to really look at the reduction of using them, especially in high pedestrian areas. And engineers have been very engaged in conversation with me about it. So I think when you can advocate on your local level to find other solutions for moving that traffic through intersections, because there's just, even I'm starting to dig into what do they do in Europe, and I'm not finding a lot of great solutions there either. So yeah, Secretary, if you find out things on your end to share back through me, that would be awesome.
Okay, well, I appreciate the context you just provided, so that is helpful, but I will still follow up to see, you know, because I think there are sometimes when, for other safety improvements, you know, they're felt to be necessary. So, you know, I get the point about trying not to do them in heavily populated areas, but when we do, to see how we can accommodate better.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep, exactly.
And then on President Biden's proposal, I think there's a lot that's in there that could be very helpful to Wisconsin. And that they had a very strong focus on pedestrians and moving people, and not just on vehicular traffic. And so I know it's going to be going through the sausage making process as it goes through the Congress, but as it's proposed right now, I think there are a lot of things that we could use those federal dollars for here that could improve accessibility significantly.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions if there's time.
Sure.
Steve asks, does complete streets include sidewalks? Many sidewalks stop in the middle of the block in residential areas here in Janesville and elsewhere. Is this simply a local concern?
That generally is a local concern. Complete streets usually is more with some other accommodations, but I think there are times where sidewalks do come into play with that, but more often than not, that is a local decision.
Thank you. And Aaron is asking, we often focus on legislative advocacy, but are there opportunities for advocacy at the agency level as well?
Sure, I think there are, and I think with our region folks, I think a lot of you are doing that. You know, hopefully we're setting a feeling for the culture that we want to have here at the DOT, and we like to think that that permeates down to all of our 3,400 employees. But I think anytime that you've got the ability to interact with people with our agency and explain things, I find that the vast majority of our people that work here want to do what's best for people, and sometimes they aren't as educated on some ways some things impact all folks as they need to be. I personally think our non-driver advisory committee is doing as much to help educate us internally as it is to help with some policy externally. So I think advocacy at that level makes sense.
One of the things I want to add to Secretary is how much I've appreciated that the department has done considerably more reach out with things like the 2050 state transportation plan and the 2050 rail plan. So I'd encourage folks on this call to go to the WISDOT website and get signed up for alerts on those things. I recently participated in a 2050 rail plan equity conversation to make sure that they're looking at building a rail plan that achieves equity from a variety of perspectives. And WISDOT worked really hard to make the 2050 transportation plan survey in an accessible format so that it was screen reader accessible. So those are tools that are available to us as residents of the state, and and it's an invitation for all of us to utilize those tools.
Thank you for adding that, Denise. I owe you a royalty for that because I should have mentioned that in my opening comments. We are going through a process that we're calling Connect 2050, and it really is trying to engage the public on what our transportation network should look like in 2050. And we're going to be going back out. We've already done a fair amount of outreach and some surveys and asking the public to weigh in. But we're going to be going back out later this spring again. And I would really encourage people to share your thoughts and opinions on that. So I really do appreciate that. And also on the passenger rail front, I think, we had an exceptional year last year in terms of garnering federal dollars. We got almost $40 million from the federal government for some passenger rail improvements. The fact that it fell right in the middle of the COVID pandemic, took away from that. But part of that money is to bring in another line from the Twin Cities down to Madison, down to Chicago, that runs on the Empire line, which we're really excited about the prospects of that. The on time will be much better. The Empire Builder right now goes all the way out to the West Coast and back. So you can imagine that makes some of the specific on-time stops here in Wisconsin a little less reliable. This will originate in Twin Cities and only go to Chicago and back. So we think that on-time reliability is going to be much increased, as well as that additional line. And we're also got some dollars to increase the routes on the Hiawatha line between Milwaukee and Chicago. So we've been really thrilled about some of the passenger rail things we've been able to do there. And again, with what President Biden's administration is proposing here, we think there's some opportunities to even greatly increase on that. Amtrak put out a map of where they'd like to be, as Denise was talking about, by 2050. And I think there's a lot of exciting opportunities there as well.
That's exciting. Thank you so much. So, Secretary, we really want to honor your time and thank you so much for your gift of that and the department's perspective and work on creating greater transportation equity. And we all want to wish you well as you continue through the confirmation process. The council submitted a letter in support of your confirmation, and we will all keep our fingers crossed for good results on that.
Well, I appreciate it. And thank you so much for doing that, Denise. And again, thank you for your partnership and leadership on our non-driver advisory committee. So
You're
thanks,
so
everyone.
welcome. Yeah. Take good care.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Aaron, let me turn it back to you and Michael to finish out the hour with where we are headed, getting those elevator speeches ready, making those appointments, and we'll save some time too for any last questions.
Michael, do you have anything that you would like to add? I know that we didn't get a chance for you to talk before Secretary Thompson joined us.
Thank you. I don't need to talk, but since you asked, the only couple things I would add to your comments, Aaron, is we talked about the opportunities for input, which is so important. And that's why I'm so grateful for everybody taking the time to participate in the legislative training and now this important topic. In addition to the public hearings that Aaron mentioned, one is virtual, so please take note, and we will be sending alerts out about that. We anticipate registration opening for that April 28th event, hopefully next week. We are hearing rumors of 2 weeks prior. So we will get that out to folks. And then there are opportunities to write. You can write your legislator. Even if your legislator is not on joint finance, they all relate to other legislators that are on joint finance. That's how they kind of set up the process there. So to write your legislator, to call them, to meet with them. They are meeting, some of them are meeting in person, but they're all on the phone, Zoom. So there's opportunities there. But certainly if you're more comfortable writing, it's so important for them to hear from folks. And then just to give you a sense, we talked about this at the legislative trainings, but in terms of the timing, this is a time of year. So today there's actually, and yesterday, there's agency briefings where Joint Finance brings together some agencies to ask them questions, to hear about, what their priorities are. Today was DNR and PSC, which includes broadband, one of our issues. But then the public hearing and public input is the rest of the month. And the opportunities for the public hearing and the virtual public hearing, also accessing the Joint Finance website with input through that portal, that will all end when the public hearings end on April 28th. But you can still continue to advocate directly to your legislators. But beginning in May, we anticipate that Joint Finance will begin voting on the budget, agency by agency, item by item. And the things that we care about, in particular, transportation and human service area, education, these things will be later, maybe the second half of May, but they'll start voting and they hope to get the budget out of Joint Finance to the full legislature for the month of June. And then under the state law, they're supposed to get it to the governor by the end of June for his signature. So we'll see. But April is a very important month for input. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
So let's see if there are either questions that folks would like to ask, or if you'd like any feedback on, maybe what you're thinking about for your elevator speech. We have a few minutes left, and this is a great opportunity to get some support and feedback if you'd appreciate that. And then we'll touch again in closing. Aaron, I'll ask you to just review the steps in finding your legislator and setting up that visit, just as a quick review for folks. And we'll reinforce to sending out some handouts. But let's see first if there's any questions or any ideas of what you'd like to be able to enhance in your elevator speech.
Denise, if I may ask one?
Yeah, absolutely. Is that you, John?
Yes, it is.
All right.
Under the last round of relief through the COVID relief, our local governments are going to get a substantial amount of money. And do you know if any of that money could be used for anything that we could advocate for?
That's an awesome question. Michael or Aaron, do you want to kick it off to, imagine the two of you have studied this a little bit more than I've had an opportunity to yet.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, there is money in the American Rescue Plan Act that was dedicated to transit. So local transit will be getting money to help support transit, which is great. And then as you pointed out, every state in the country is getting flexible relief funding. So in Wisconsin, we are getting, I believe the total number the governor has control over is about $3.2 billion with a B dollars. And there are specific criteria laid out in the American Rescue Plan Act about how states can use those funds. I mean, it is flexible, it's at the governor's discretion, but there are some kind of guardrails. And one of the guardrails is infrastructure, which could include broadband or could include other things related to transportation. So yes, there absolutely are opportunities to advocate to the governor's office for how they could use these. And I think important to note, it's one-time funding. So the governor's office and the Department of Transportation and other agencies have been very clear. They will not use any of this money to fund long-term things. These need to be kind of one-off projects or pieces of funding. So a lot of the money previously that has gone out the door has been in the form of grant programs to fund just kind of very targeted things. So yes, you're absolutely right. There's money on the table that the governor will have discretion over using that can be used for infrastructure, which would include transportation needs. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I do have one more. I'm sorry,
Go
but
for it. Mhm.
so is this something that we maybe want to put into our elevator speeches, that money's there and some of it could be used for this with our representatives? Just let them know, because there's a lot of one-time deals that would really help us out. It wouldn't have to be long-term. The stuff is there now. It can be added to. They're working on projects and stuff like that. Yeah, I hope you understand that question.
I do, yeah.
Yes.
I would just point out that the legislature does not have control over how the money is spent. This is 100% in the governor's control. And they are getting feedback from agencies. So Secretary Thompson can help have input. So I would encourage you to reach out to the governor's office or DOT. Those would be the avenues. I don't know, Michael, if you have other feedback on that.
Yeah, I would just add that Aaron's absolutely right, that the governor has control over most of the money, and he's really looking to stakeholders and the agencies for their input. So direct contact to the governor's office is good, but also if it's under transportation, for example, it would be good to let them know as well for different ideas. But your original question talking about money going directly to counties or municipalities, there is money that bypasses the governor that goes to, Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of the Madison-Dane County area and the Milwaukee area, because they're larger, and that's kind of how they structured it. But everybody else is going to get money as well. So you're absolutely right about looking at the local level to see what the opportunities are. There's a fair amount of discretion, and every county will be different of what kind of input they'll entertain, but certainly they ask your county supervisor or the county exec or manager for those opportunities as well. What's complicated, and we can't really, no one really understands it, is how this plays into the budget process. Because the legislature would like more control of the money to kind of look at that in the larger budget picture. And so the timelines don't really match up. So that's something that will be in the news, and we'll be reporting on that as well. But I think for our advocacy, it's kind of, you can mention to legislators, but they're really focused on the budget. So certainly your local, and as well as the departments and the governor. I hope that's helpful. It is a little complicated.
I understand that, but just one question, because I was at the county board meeting yesterday, a committee meeting, and they said that Marathon County will get their direct money from the federal government.
Right.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understand that correct. And thank you you've answered it. I'm trying to make heads or tails of this because the money is there.
Yeah,
exactly, John.
Yeah, Michael's right. So there is a large pot coming directly to the governor, and there is another pot for local governments. That is true.
Yeah, I'm kind of guessing, Aaron, was it 178 million, or it's a lot of money that's being divided up. So, and that's great that you're in Marathon, and they're probably, one of the larger counties. Good.
Thank you.
Great. Good question. Thank you. So it is just 1 o'clock now, and I want to honor folks' time. So Aaron, will you review some reminders about connecting with your legislator, how to do that if you don't have contact info? And then I'll review some of the things that folks should be watching for going further.
Yeah, so again, for our next steps, the council is encouraging you, if you participated in the session yesterday and today, the next steps are to reach out to your state representative and state senator to set up a visit. Um, Basically, we do have like a little handout that's a step-by-step guide that we will be sending out later this week. But you can find your lawmakers' contact information using either the state's legislative hotline, which is a toll-free number that is on our handout that we'll be sending out, or the state's legislative website. It is not super screen reader accessible, but there is contact information for your lawmakers on that website as well, which is legis.wisconsin.gov. And then just tips for you can either call your legislator's office or send an email. Either is fine. You'll get a response either way. But just generally making sure to point out that you are a constituent. Constituents get preferences in setting up a meeting with their lawmaker. Because of COVID-19, most offices are open to doing virtual, but you have to specify that. The office will assume you're setting up an in-person visit at the Capitol. So make sure you say that you want to do a virtual visit, and they can help facilitate that for you. And then length of time is usually a 30-minute meeting. Also, as people are getting vaccinated, if you are comfortable, you can also ask to do an in-person visit in the district. Legislators are usually comfortable to set something up at a coffee shop or things like that when they're back home in the district. So those are kind of the options there. And again, as Michael mentioned, public hearings on the budget are starting this week. You have 2 minutes to testify. There's 3 in person, 1 virtual. You'll get the link out when you can register for virtual. Denise, did I miss anything?
No, you did awesome. So Rhonda Stotts reminded me yesterday, and I want to make sure I highlight this, that in addition to the resources that Aaron shared about how to find out who your legislator is, you can also contact the reference desk of your local public library, and those reference librarians are amazing. They can also assist. So, use that as another resource. Watch in your email for that handout to come yet this week. And then remember that your legislators will all be getting our issue briefs or our priority documents. They'll get them in 2 ways, email, and they'll also get hard copies of them, likely either at the end of this week or the very beginning of next week. All of those documents are on our website. So I'd highly recommend reviewing those as you're preparing for your visit with your legislator. And I'd recommend setting what I call a pivot date, which means when are you going to take action? So what day are you going to get your legislator's contact information if you don't have it already? When are you going to set up that meeting? And then remember that we'll get back together as a group on May 7th at noon to debrief, to do some story sharing of what your visits were like and what you were learning. So on that note, please remember you can always reach out to me with questions. Feel free to do that. If you would like to come to the voting and accessibility session tomorrow and you are not already signed up, we would gladly welcome you. Just reach out to Kathleen and she will provide you with the link and get you registered. So on that note, thank you everybody for devoting your lunchtime to this important focus of transportation equity. And we're so glad you were here. Thank you.